Hey people, welcome to Accidental Gods, to the podcast where we still believe that another world is possible, and that if we all work together, there is time to lay the foundations for that future that we would be proud to leave to the generations that come after us. I'm Manda Scott, and generally speaking, I'm your host as well as your fellow traveller, and I talk to other people on the podcast. But once in a while, often near the winter or the summer solstice, I do a roundup of the things that I had been reading and watching and listening to that I think you might enjoy. So this is one of these. I will endeavour to keep it short and sweet, and there will be links in the show notes so that you can follow through and find whatever it was I was talking about. So here we go. There is no particular order to any of these, it's just what occurred to me as I was writing the list, and I'm starting with nonfiction. I read a lot of nonfiction at the moment, partly because I'm heading into a new book and cramming my head full of ideas may get me past the point where I have 5 separate starts to 5 completely different books, at least one of which is now totally obsolete because I started writing it last May when Any Human Power came out. So I'm looking at what's possible, what's around, what people are thinking, and what is in the solution space. Okay, that's a particularly horrible phrase. Pretend I didn't say that. But who's got ideas that will actually work, that could take us forward through the pinch point of the moment? Because you might have been listening to this podcast for a while, and I did keep talking about pinch points. I am seriously hoping it doesn't get pinchier than it is at the moment. Though I suspect this time next year I might be saying that again with more feeling. So here we go. Nonfiction. Top of my list is Right Story, Wrong Story by Tyson Yunkaporta. If you've read Sand Talk, then you will need no introduction to this. If you haven't, I didn't get on that well with Sand Talk, and I don't really know why, but I really have enjoyed Right Story, Wrong Story. Tyson is an academic First Nations Australian, and in this book, he is exploring the nature of narrative. And Right Story is the First Nations Indigenous narrative, and Wrong Story is our trauma culture narrative. And if you haven't heard me unpicking initiation and trauma cultures, I will put a link to the first time I talked about this with Alnur Lada about a year ago now. So if you listen to the podcast at all, you know that this is quite a big idea in my whole mindset and framing of where we are, and that helping our trauma cultures step forward into what would be a digital age initiation culture is right at the top of what I think we need to do. And so when somebody who belongs to an Indigenous culture is writing something from that perspective, but also with a mindset slightly of Western reductive academia, it's really interesting. And I am not planning to quote to you from every book in this list, but I want to read you just a tiny little bit from Right Story, Wrong Story. So here we go. All this wrong story is moving towards an important message. There are some inefficiencies, multipolar traps, perverse incentive structures, and self-terminating algorithms in the current global system that could use some analysis from an Aboriginal point of view. At the same time, we have to be realistic and acknowledge that ancient wisdom is not your one-stop shop for salvation through regenerative design. It is easy and comforting to assume the hypothesis that this ancient method of inquiry and holistic knowledge system will contain all the answers. But it probably doesn't. Moreover, on my own, I do not have the skills, knowledge, perspective, cultural competence, or qualifications to undertake any such analysis. I do, however, belong to a vast web of relationships made of yarns and connections, and this entity certainly is capable of the computational work necessary to examine the complicated systems that are currently burning our world. So there we go. That is someone who lives on the opposite side of the planet from me, describing the need for us to connect with ourselves, each other, and especially the web of life in order to figure out what we need to do next. So you'll see why I rather like this book. But that's not the only reason. It's beautifully written. It's really interestingly structured, and I totally recommend it for your solstice reading. Next on the list is Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who is also Vanessa Andriotti. And if you listen to Nate Hagen's or a bunch of other similar podcasts, she's been on these a lot recently. And Hospicing Modernity is not an easy read. But it does feel to me like one of the essentials for understanding that our system was always broken. It has always been predicated on the wrong value set. I'm talking about the hegemonic system of the trauma culture. That which we have exported right around the planet and which is in the process of becoming, as Tyson said, a self-terminating algorithm. What Vanessa, like Tyson, does is to help us understand that this is not a natural way of human thinking. It's just human nature is one of the absolute baselines of the trauma culture, of the incredibly toxic system we live in, telling us that the things that our core souls know are not useful are in fact the way humanity is. And I think it doesn't hurt to be reminded that this is not the case. Way back, we had Graeber and Wengrow with The Dawn of Everything, which was on one of my previous must-read lists, and if you haven't read it yet, definitely that's worth reading too. But Hospicing Modernity, like Right Story, Wrong Story, helps us to get a sense of what else is possible. A similar one on the list is Flourishing Kin, Indigenous Foundations for Collective Wellbeing by Yuria Kelidwin. Might be Kelidwin, I don't know. But anyway, again, this is a really uplifting, totally beautiful book. It's beautiful to look at. The cover is utterly gorgeous. And the content does what it says on the tin. It's offering us that concept that we can flourish, that flourishing is innate to who we are, and we do have the capacity to do this. We just need to let go of the old boundaries that told us that the old system was the only thing. You know, that whole thing that says it's easier to imagine the total extinction of all life on Earth than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. We have to let go of that. And so these three books, Right Story, Wrong Story, Hospicing Modernity, and particularly Flourishing Kin, I think will help us let go of that and step into something different. Next in the series is Pedagogies of Collapse, A Hopeful Education for the End of the World as We Know It, by Ginny Servant-Miklos. And you don't read this unless you are feeling very well resourced. It is, in the end, a hopeful education. But my goodness, the early chapters. I really thought that I understood the breadth and depth of how bad things are, how close we are to the edge of collapse. And then I read this book and I didn't sleep very well for a couple of nights. And I spend my life in this field. So I still think it's an incredibly good book. It's really well written. It's totally worth reading because how we educate ourselves, and particularly the generations that are alive now, is utterly vital. But don't expect an easy read. You have been warned. So then the last one on the nonfiction list is a beautiful read, and it's really uplifting, totally cheering, and utterly gorgeous. It's called Down the Rabbit Hole, Misadventures of an Unlikely Naturalist. It's by Charlie Bennett, and it has illustrations by the author. And he lives in Northumberland. And this is such a beautiful evocation of his connection to the land there. And it's really mystical. He genuinely is connecting to the land and everything that's on it. As a modern farmer, or at least not a modern industrial farmer, but a modern person engaged in farming. And it's published by a small Northumberland press, and there are illustrations in there by Charlie. And if you follow the link in the show notes, it takes you to his website, and you can buy some of the prints, and they're gorgeous. And because he and I have been talking back and forth, because I do want to talk to him on the podcast, I know there's another book coming out sometime soon. So this one is gorgeous. Honestly, I have literally just bought 5 copies to give to all the people I give books to at Christmas so that they can have one each. Last year, that Give to Everyone book was 2 lights, And the year before it was The Club at the Edge of Town. So you know the quality of the books that I want to give to my friends. And this is it, Down the Rabbit Hole by Charlie Bennett. And I promise you, it will reconnect you to your heart and your soul and the understanding that we can, even in modernity, connect to the world outside the windows. Truly, it's a gorgeous book. So now we're moving on to fiction. And I haven't got so much here, partly because I spend a lot of time reading nonfiction, partly because when I'm reading other things, it's mostly books about dog training, of which I have to say the best at the moment is How to Raise a Puppy by Stephanie Russo and Turid Rugas. If you're into dogs at all, if you're planning to breed, if you think you're getting a puppy, How to Raise a Puppy is the one. Turid Rugas is the Norwegian dog behaviorist who wrote the original seminal book on calming signals in dogs. And if you have anything to do with dogs, you need that book. And then this is a follow-on from someone who is one of the best dog behaviorists on the planet. I didn't mean to do that. It's not my list. It just happens to be on my desk because, hey, I can read it in between doing other stuff. So back to the fiction. Okay, my list is like this. First is Ministry of Time. I think it's actually The Ministry of Time by Kellyanne Bradley. And because of Any Human Power, I've been reading a lot of books that shift around timelines. And this is a first novel. This is one of the best first novels I have ever read. And it's gorgeous. It's beautifully written. The concept is astonishing. At a point in the future, not very far ahead from wherever we are when I read it, the government has discovered how to move through time. Specifically, they have a machine that will take them back. And they want to find out what happens if you bring somebody forward from a time in the past. But everybody's read lots of time travel books, and they know that if you lift somebody out of an important event in the past, you could potentially change the whole of reality. And then the people conducting the experiment might not exist, or they might exist in a concentration camp because the fascists took over early or something. So they're really keen not to do that. So what they do instead is go back and lift someone who is just about to die, that they are absolutely certain this is the case. And then the people that they just brought from the 1600s, or the particular focus of the book is somebody who was on an Arctic expedition, and they're paired up with people in the modern world who are there to basically help them adjust to the 21st century. So there we go. It's a love story. It's science fiction, I guess, but it's also a very interesting examination of the nature of time and identity and what we do as both. And there are twists that I am fairly certain you won't see coming, but I could be wrong. So enjoy. Next on my list is Venomous Lumpsucker by Ned Bowman. And clearly I missed a trick with this one because it actually won the Arthur C. Clarke Award in 2023. So I'm not pretending all of these are completely new. They're just the ones that I found this year. And Venomous Lumpsucker is another one that explores the edges of where we're at. This is dystopian. And again, if you've been paying attention to anything I've said in the last 6 months, you'll notice I think dystopias are actually not that useful anymore. We can see how bad things are getting. We can see it around the world. In our actual present, we don't need people painting futures where things are worse. But Ned Bowman has done a number of very, very clever things, pulling together ideas that are floating around in the technosphere, the kind of alt-right of the technosphere, but merging them with some genuinely dystopian views forward of what happens when the predatory capitalist model really goes to town and yet is still covering itself with completely specious greenwash. So the venomous lumpsucker of the title is a fish that is basically verging on extinction. And the core two characters are exceptionally well drawn. And one of them is a woman who's an ecologist who is trying to find the last known habitats of the venomous lumpsucker. And the other is a truly unpleasant, unlovable individual who has got himself into a corner by basically betting his company's money on something that went south. And he has to find the venomous lumpsucker in order to save himself from a long term in what will be a deeply unpleasant jail. And so they team up. And it's not actually a love story. It never becomes that. I don't think that's too much of a spoiler because it never really looks like it's going to. But the sway back and forth of motivation within what is really quite a narrow structure, as a novelist, I found fascinating, and I think as a general reader is well worth reading. And it's incredibly funny for something that is so horribly dystopian. There are so many utterly unexpected laugh-out-loud lines in there that quite disturbed faith when I was reading it. It's not a short book. It's not one of these ones where your eyes glance down the page and barely touch and you can flip through 200 or 300 pages in a night. It probably took me about a week. And I was genuinely laughing every evening, even while bits of me were curling up inside with how horribly, potentially accurate it is. I think we'll go over a lot of cliff edges before actual technology and predatory capitalism get quite so bad. But I could be wrong, in which case Ned Bowman has probably written something incredibly prescient. So it's fun. Give it a go. Okay, so the next two on my list are books that don't actually exist yet, as in they're not out in the world. First is Catherine Addison's Tomb of Dragons, which isn't actually out until the 11th of March in the US and a little bit after that in the UK. But I just read the advanced reading copy because her book that started this series, The Goblin Emperor, is one of those books that I have read easily 8 or 9 times, possibly more than that. It's one of the ones that I pick up when I just want something that's really beautifully written, but isn't going to macerate my heart or in other ways leave me feeling discombobulated. It's just a really lovely book, and I find new layers to it each time I read it. The other one, if you're interested, that I read a lot is The Half-Life of Valerie Kay, and prior to that it was The Kingdoms, both by Natasha Pulley. I could read Natasha Pulley back to back, probably for the rest of my life and not get bored. But Catherine Addison's Cemeteries of Amallo series, which are the 3 that came after The Goblin Emperor, are also amongst my favourites, and this is the 3rd of the 3. So if you're not familiar with her work, you have time to go back and read The Goblin Emperor, and then if you enjoy that, you can head into the 3 that constitute the Cemeteries of Amallo series, The Witness for the Dead, The Grief of Stones, and by the time you're done with those, The Tomb of Dragons will probably be out. The entire series is set in what might be considered a steampunk universe where goblins are dark-skinned and generally shunned by the elves, who are tall and fair-skinned and own and run almost everything. And the Goblin Emperor is Maya, who is half goblin, half elf because geopolitics in this world. And he ends up becoming the emperor and has to survive in a world that he completely doesn't understand. He is a really decent person. Along with Rachel Neumeier and Victoria Goddard, Catherine Addison is really, really good at creating non-toxic masculinity. And then one of the characters in The Goblin Emperor was an elvish cleric, Sarah Kelleher, I think, who then becomes the lead character in The Grief of Stones and going on through to The Tomb of Dragons. And he is someone who can lay his hands on someone who has died and experience their emotions. And so he's very useful for the Goblin Emperor, Maya, when he wants to find out who has killed his father and all of his brothers, which is the reason he becomes the emperor. This is not a spoiler. This happens in the first chapter. But then Sarah Kelleher comes along and is obviously a very troubled individual. And Addison handles his characterization really beautifully through the next 3 books, and the waxing and the waning of his fealty to his God. Actually, that never wanes, but it is severely challenged, and his capacity to be a witness for the dead, which is what he is when he lays his hands on someone who has been killed in whatever manner. And it's beautifully mannered work. There's a lot of elvish and goblin opera in here, and very subtle interracial biases and people stepping over lines. And the whole thing is just emotionally literate, and that's really hard to find in things that also have a plot, which I think is one of the reasons I enjoy them. So there we go. Tomb of Dragons coming out in March, but you can read everything leading up to it before then. And then the other on my list that doesn't exist yet is Murder in the Climate Assembly by Denise Baden, who has been on the podcast and is setting up a Kickstarter to help get this book off the ground. Denise is a professor of sustainability, and she set up the publishing house Green Stories and started writing her own fiction as ways to get the reality out into the world. And now with this, the script version of this book won the 2024 Writing Climate Pitch Fest, and she's using the settings of a university and a climate assembly to explore the kind of topics that we cover every week in the podcast. She is taking a Throughtopian approach to show what society might look like in her view if we actually did it well, and then showcasing how we get from here to there. So if you support the ideas of this, I have put a link to the Kickstarter in the show notes. Please do go and register your interest and then support it when it goes live, which I believe will be in February. So that's it for fiction. I don't think I've read much else that I would want to push on anybody out there. There are a few films that I think are worth watching. First is Richard Wayne's The Oath of the Hopeful. It's very short. It's on YouTube. It's a film version of one of his Throughtopian poems, and it is exactly this. It's an oath with video behind it, and it's beautiful. Really go and check that out. The next is Roots So Deep, which is a regenerative film created in the US. And the basic premise is farmer on one side of the fence is farming regeneratively, farmer on the other side of the fence is an industrial farmer. Let's start making a documentary and see what happens. If you have any reach with anyone who thinks industrial farming is a good way forward, you want to sit down and watch this film with them. It's beautiful, it's moving, the human interactions are really interesting to watch, and the end result is incontrovertible in favour, surprise, surprise, of regenerative farming. The next one is not so much fun, The Shopping Conspiracy, which is on Netflix. I have put a link to the trailer in the show notes and then to the full film. This is another one, a bit like Pedagogies of Collapse, where you want to be resilient before you watch it. Again, I think I know this stuff, and then I look at the waste, the utter mindless waste that is a result of people who just don't care, making decisions that are destroying all of us. It will probably stop you ever buying anything as a Christmas present ever again. So I'm just warning you that. But again, this is part of the current system. We need to dismantle the current system. And if Netflix is showing films like this, then I think increasing the viewer count is quite important, so that they know that we know that this matters. And then last on the list of films is one that, like the last two books, is not out yet. Future Council is billed as School of Rock meets An Inconvenient Truth, where the filmmaker Damon Gamo takes 8 children on the ultimate school excursion, a road trip across Europe to challenge powerful leaders and find solutions to our greatest ecological challenges. If you listen to Nate Higgins, he talked to 3 of the young people on the film. So I think this is essential viewing, partly to support the people making it, partly to support the young people who are in it, but mainly because they're going to show us things that we need to see. So it's due for release in Australia in early 2025, and then across the rest of the world. I genuinely don't know when it'll come to whatever jurisdiction you're in, but please keep an eye out, and when it's out, see if you can get to see it. And finally, there's a handful of podcasts that I think everybody should be listening to. I've put links in the show notes to all of them. Very briefly, there's one on Farm Gate, which is one of my must-listen podcasts, and this one is called What is Bill Gates Doing to Africa's Food? I had this idea that Bill Gates was one of the good guys, and actually he's just a white colonialist, if this is true, who has really bizarre techno-dystopian ideas of how we can control all of the food systems by just mashing them into straight lines and full-on industrial petrochemical agriculture. It's horrible. And I didn't know all that, so it's probably another one where you need to be resilient. The one that you can listen to that doesn't need resilience is the one where he talks to Charlie Bennett of Down the Rabbit Hole. And it's just gorgeous. Honestly, if you just want a podcast to really lift you up, that's the one. I've put a link to the Great Simplification Future Council, How Children Are Responding to the Planetary Crisis, which refers to the film that I just talked about. If you want another one to really lift you up, then What is a Good Life with Mark McCartney. Every single one of his episodes is gorgeous, but a recent one, Rekindling Our Wild Nature with Dermot Ling, is just beautiful. Apart from anything else, they both have utterly gorgeous Irish accents, and listening to two really sorted, switched on, emotionally literate men talking about emotional literacy has got to be one of the best listens of the year. And they're doing it in beautiful accents. So definitely go for that one. And then last on my current list is Wild with Sarah Wilson, who is, I think, a very big journalist in Australia. I hadn't come across her before, but I gather she's quite huge. And she was talking to Indy Johar, and she has titled this podcast, The Starkest Collapse Prognosis I've Heard. Which I think kind of means she's not listening to the same podcast I'm listening to, but it's still a really good listen. And I am planning to talk to Indy early in the new year. So you could consider this as a starting point for that, because I will probably listen to it about 8 times before I talk to Indy, so that I'm completely familiar with everything he said, and we can move on using that as our baseline. So there we go. That's it. Things to read, things to watch, things to listen to. There are an infinite number of other things I could have done. There are a whole bunch of blogs out there. And if you're not reading Stephen Spoonermore's Substack on how he alleges the American election was fixed, it's quite blood-curdling, probably worth it. And I'm sure you have other things that you really enjoy and that you would have liked me to include. However, this is the list I came up with when I sat down, so we're going with it. So that's it for now. As ever, we'll be back in a couple of days probably with an actual conversation with an actual person. In the meantime, thank you to Cara C for the music at the head and foot, and either Caro or Alan for producing this episode. Thanks to Lou Mayer for doing the YouTube, which is going to be interesting because I have not done a video of this. I really don't like watching myself on video, and just 100% of me is not going to be fun. So I think you'll see a lot of book covers and clips from films maybe. I don't know, creative stuff. Thanks to Anne Thomas for the transcripts. Thanks to Faith for keeping me sane. And as ever, thank you to you for being there, for caring, and for listening. If you're looking for something to do this week, 5 stars and a review on the podcast app of your choice would be really nice. Subscribing would be good too. Both of these get us onto the algorithms and get us in front of more people. Thank you. We will be back next week. In the meantime, have an amazing solstice. Sit still with the dark times. Connect your heart and your soul to the web of life in the best way you can. And we'll see you in a couple of days. Thank you, and goodbye.